welcome to the first LawTech.Live webinar on wellbeing. It's obviously a very important topic for the law, especially when statistics at the moment are quite alarming. A recent law.com and ALM survey this year actually said that almost 1 in 5 respondents had contemplated suicide during the course of their legal careers. And about 35% of respondents said they suffered from depression in 2021, with anxiety levels at 67%. This is quite prominent between 26 to 35 years, displaying high levels of burnout and reporting the lowest of autonomy, low psychological safety, and high work intensity score. 92% of lawyers have suffered from burnout and stress, according to a Legatics and YouGov survey on mental well-being during May 2022. So I think we can all agree it's a topic that should be explored a lot more. And I'm delighted to introduce to you Helen, former City law firm partner turned psychotherapist and wellbeing and performance coach, and Jens, experienced occupational psychologist, the co-founder of Ambition Profile, and then of course myself, Nick, the founder and CEO of Ruby Data, document and data collaboration company. So Helen, please can you introduce yourself in a little more detail and why you made that transition from law to wellbeing?
Yeah, sure. Hi, lovely to see you both today. So, I was trained at Linklaters. I was in the Magic Circle for about 5 years, and then I moved firms a couple of times and ended up at the firm Rosling King, which is where I made partner at 6 years qualified. And I think I really sort of made the transition into, training as a psychotherapist and also launching my business in coaching, because I saw so much need in the legal sector on the inside. Across the whole industry, really. I guess it's law, it's finance, it's the City of London. People are working extremely hard. People are often very overworked and, suffering with mental health issues, and well-being just isn't optimized like it could be. So what I wanted to do was somebody sort of from the inside who could offer something which would help people to, feel better in themselves and then perform better and just live happier, more fulfilled lives, really.
Yeah, sure. And do you see an increase in demand for that over the years, or is it's something that you feel is quite new to the law?
I mean, I think well-being in the law has been an issue ever since I joined. I think what's really apparent to me now is that it's more widely spoken about. Whether that means that initiatives are actually helping people in the way that they should is another question, I think. But I think when I first started 10 years ago, I don't think these conversations were even really happening as much. I think now, especially since the pandemic, people are speaking out a lot more about what they want, about what they need, about flexible working and all of that sort of stuff. I think we've also got Gen Z coming through who are actually demanding something different. So I think in that respect, the landscape is changing. Equally, I think what's clear from all of the different surveys in this country, abroad, America, internationally, etc., that they all show that we've essentially got an epidemic on our hands in terms of lawyer wellbeing and mental health. So there's still a lot of work to be done, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think burnout is probably the number one symptom amongst lawyers?
I mean, I think burnout, essentially that it's when you're extremely overworked, it's a consequence of, it's not just something which happens overnight. And I think when people say just snap out of it, that's just not possible. It's something which wears the body down, it wears the immune system down, it affects our brain, it affects our nervous system, and it can have really, really serious consequences. In a sense, it's not that surprising that it affects the legal industry. I mean, many people are working under extreme stress, extremely long hours through the day, through the night, over extended periods of time. And because of that, I think it's no wonder really that people are going to suffer from burnout and just reach that point of collapse if they're not doing something before that to help themselves feel better on the whole. And I think the irony is that the profession is full of, these high achievers who want to perform at their best and do at their best and do their best and be really, really successful. And I can resonate with that myself. But because of that, you keep pushing yourself harder, but you don't realize that, it's a bit like a Formula One race. If you don't do your pit stop and change your tires, you will burn through them and you will come off the track.
I love that analogy. It's very appropriate. With that in mind, Jens, I think it'd be good to move on to you and ask you a little bit more about what you do, because you come from quite a different background, and with a lot more of a scientific or mathematical approach with this test that you've created. Can you tell us a bit more, please?
Sure. So I did my master's thesis at the psychology program on lawyers in Sweden, national study, and it was specifically on burnout. And this was 17 years ago. And interestingly enough, I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. The term burnout actually comes from lawyers. So the big pioneer within the burnout research, Christina Mastak, who actually empirically validated it. She had friends who were lawyers talking about burnout, and she was really interested in that particular phenomena. So she validated. So I'm building upon her research. So all I'm doing really is mirroring what Helen has been describing, which is really interesting. So you have a working situation with a lot of demands, a lot of sources of stress, and then you have highly ambitious people. And it is that particular combination that is giving rise to such high levels of burnout. If you have people that are laid back and chill and say, I don't care, I'm just going to go home, it's 5 o'clock, you're not going to get burnt out. It is that overcommitment together with those high demands. And people that have that drive, that super drive, basically we're talking about insecure overachiever in general, they seek careers that are validating them in various ways. And certainly lawyering is doing that financially and in terms of status, and also engaging work and supporting clients. So there is a psychological grammar that is attracting people with these particular traits. And so as I tried to, in various ways, address the problem in law firms, I noticed that traditional stress management wasn't really working at all. And that it only really sort of opened up once I took into account that highly ambitious orientation towards work and how it is hooking up with the demands in the workplace. And once you hold up a mirror, which is what we're doing with the psychometric testing, people recognize themselves because this is what they're doing, not just at work, but also during evenings and weekends and so on. Burnout is often a combination of high demands off work and on work together. And those demands are not just sort of randomly ending up in your lap. You are consciously and unconsciously cultivating in various ways. But once they recognize that, they often sort of stop in their tracks, and then they will start to consider that. So holding up that mirror is one way of doing it. And then the type of coaching that Helen is providing is another way, because you will be able to unearth it in the sessions with a lawyer. And I certainly recommend a lawyer or a coach with a lawyering background. I think that's really a success factor for sure.
I completely agree. I think it can be quite hard to open up about your career to someone that perhaps doesn't understand the day-to-day operations that go on within firms such as a law firm. It can make it quite complicated, especially when you're perhaps using legal terms that just go over their head. I certainly know when I came into the world of law from a technology background, I quickly realized that I had to learn how lawyers talk, and that took a great deal of awkward situations and a bit of time to get to that point. But once I kind of adapted and learned the lingo, I think I was a lot more kind of respected and welcomed into the world of law. So I do think, I agree with you there. I think it's important quite often for a coach to have some sort of legal background, or at least experience working with lawyers.
It's funny you say that, actually, Nick, because I've got I've got a friend who's in legal tech as well, and he often says things to me like, "Oh, you're such a lawyer," and I'm thinking, "Oh, I just said so," you it becomes so ingrained, you don't even realize, I think, that your own industry has its own specific ways of saying and doing stuff. And I completely agree with what you both say there, because I think if people, if you're speaking to a coach or speaking to anyone who you feel like just doesn't get your situation, you're not going to open up. You're not going to be able to work through that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one subject that comes up quite a bit in our discussions around technology and how it can be used to improve the lives of lawyers is that when it comes to drafting a contract, for example, me as a company, I'll go, "Can you create this contract with this supplier?" And quite often we get something that's about 15 to 20 pages long and covering so many scenarios with kind of very little insight into the commercials of how the business actually operates. And that lawyer may have spent until 3 a.m. kind of drafting this contract. And through that lack of empathy, and obviously I'm generalizing a lot here, and that desire to kind of understand me as a business or me as a client, they've created this contract that the other side just sees and goes, "Well, that's completely wrong. Can we change it all?" And I see a lot of that, and the lawyer ends up going backwards and forwards. And then things like this is what contributes to the steps towards burnout. I think it's a lot of things that shouldn't really be happening. And if lawyers were perhaps a bit more mindful of their own well-being, they'd be able to create their space for the clients as well. Take the time to sit down with them and understand them, and not just necessarily dive straight into the extremes.
Right. And I certainly agree that I think legal tech potentially has a lot to offer when it comes to well-being and productivity. And the industry is really not at the cutting edge, so to speak. I did an assessment of Swedish law firms a year ago and asked the leaders, "How do you delegate?" And every single one of them said meetings, telephones, or emails. But if you ask in another professional services firm that is outside of the law, they're using project management tools and platforms. Emails are not very conducive for advanced business projects involving 15, 20 people, because it fractures the information. So you have to seek the information in hundreds of emails and dozens of email trails. And one of the reasons many law firms, back in 2019 said, we can't use those platforms because we can't have the client material in the cloud. It's sensitive. But then everything is in the cloud. Your emails are in the cloud. They're not driven by trucks or anything like that. So it's certainly time for, I think, the legal tech discourse to become more relevant for all the associates and all the partners in their everyday work, and not just talk about AI and what could be possible tomorrow, but really what should have been done yesterday, especially under the pandemic. And then we have hybrid work and remote work and so on, to make sure that you have a working environment that is optimizing your effectiveness. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, I think like there's a lot of kind of focus still, and there's not a webinar that goes by where I don't hear the words billable hour. It's kind of the elephant that's ever present in the room, and I think the cause for a lot of troubles within the law. I've had people say to me, "Why would I want to save time? I can bill for it." And that kind of mentality, I think, puts up all these obstacles that prevent law firms curating more technology and doing things efficiently, because it's all about the billable hour and racking up as many hours as possible. So I think that's one of the key cultures that perhaps has to change.
I mean, I think on that one as well, it's interesting what you say, Jens, about there being all this different technology. And I think having stepped outside law for myself and having my own business, I've sort of realized how much more technology there is out there in the world, despite the fact I don't have a big company or anything. You just realize what's actually available. And I think talking about the billable hour, this is a huge issue, because as a lawyer, it's kind of drummed into you that your whole efficiency, your bonus, everything it's related back to how many hours you're charging. And so, actually, even something like putting in the time and effort and investment in time, in relation to finding new systems which work better for you, is something you can't afford to do, because in the short term, you won't be billing as much, and then you'll be penalized for that. So it's like the whole system has to change in terms of how people are viewing their time. And, anything which you're not charging for as a lawyer always feels like a bit of a waste. And that's a mentality which needs to change as well. Also, because as you get more senior, you need to get good at winning clients. You need to get good at BD. So actually suddenly out of nowhere, you're expected to have these skills when actually you probably haven't really had any time or opportunity to develop them. I mean, the whole system is a bit questionable in that sense.
Yeah. So the billable hours is one problem. And I think another problem is the image of the lawyer. What are the success factors that are driving success in lawyers? And often the view that is sort of conveyed through law school and also in law firms is that it all starts and ends with your legal expertise. But what is being missed then is that legal expertise is an absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need to have all the skills that facilitate that in terms of being organized time-wise, in stress management, in being able to instill trust in clients and leadership and all those things. So there are a lot of soft skills that are not provided in law school and in a very, very small scale in law firms, certainly insufficient. And law school in general is a poor preparation for work in a law firm. So when you look at the research on stress levels in lawyers, you see that there's a bump initially in the career because you have a gap between law school and law firm. So that is kind of disorienting the first couple of years before you sort of land on your feet. So you do learn these things, but you learn them the hard way, the inefficient way, which is really poor. But really the over focus on legal skills, which I'm not really downplaying at all, but it's not sufficient in itself. And it really should be providing a lot more training in all these other skills that I think are not provided anywhere in the whole talent management cycle from law school to partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's something that we're seeing technology brought into law schools at the moment and a lot more kind of training in that area. But yeah, things like wellbeing is still quite some distance off, I think. For sure.
So I'll just type in the chat box the best book on success factors for lawyers, which I think could be of interest for participants.
Do you think you could post the link to your test as well, please?
Sure, absolutely.
Is that a test that's kind of designed to be done once or many times periodically?
I think the most important one is to do it at least once. It's not meant to be done several times per year, but perhaps once a year. And so basically what is being assessed is the tendency towards over-engagement, which is a really strong predictor of burnout. People that are all laid back don't really become burnt out. But, when you look at lawyers, that whole tendency towards perfectionism, which you have initially when you sign up for law school, and that trait is then being rewarded in your legal work, especially the critical part. Being able to spot problems and potential problems tomorrow and always seek out the weaknesses and everything, and then not being able to turn it off. You continue when you come home and you become a lot more critical than you are perhaps aware of, because that's also a problem for many lawyers, that that identity of being a lawyer, I am a lawyer, I don't work as a lawyer, makes you really susceptible for problems and setbacks at work because you bring it home, because that's who you are. You don't have several identities to shift between, which a lot of other professions do have, because it's just a job. It's not your whole life. You want to get home from work. And so in one way, it's a privilege to have that profession and that engagement and that challenge that lawyering is providing you, but it's also eroding the boundaries between work and leisure, between your personal identity and then your professional identity. Yeah,
and it's you hit on quite a good point around identity there. I think came up previously, that if you're spending kind of your day and sometimes beyond your day until the early hours of the next morning, and what you're doing is you're thinking about worst case scenario and building that into contracts to mitigate the risk, or you're dealing with worst case scenario when it actually happens and people come to you because they need your services to represent them, and you're repeating that throughout your day, all day, every day. It's repetition creates habit, and if you're repeating that, it's probably quite easy to take that home. And I think that's why there are a lot of problems with lawyers between their families and friends and connections outside of work. It's because you're kind of wiring your brain to think differently, and that kind of awareness that you are not a lawyer, it's just a character you play during your day almost. It's like an actor going into a studio and playing out the role of someone. It's not actually who you are, it's just something that you do. I think that separation and that awareness to keep it separate is quite an important one.
I think that's a really good point, Nick. And I think it's so difficult a lot of the time for lawyers because, I mean, when it takes over such a huge part of your life, unless you've got a huge amount of sort of mental and psychological awareness, I mean, in the first place, you don't necessarily realize that you are not your thoughts, that there are different parts of you, that you're more complicated than just this sort of, I don't know, maybe one being, and you're completely attached to all of that, you know. But also, if you're working 100-hour weeks, you haven't got the time or the space to think about anything. You're just thinking, how do I get through this day? How do I get to midday? How do I get to 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, midnight? I've been there, you know. And I think we sort of have to bear in mind the backdrop of all of that. And I mean, what I always say to people I'm coaching or people I'm working with is, before you can get to the point where you can even really sort of work out how you can be happier and healthier and have the job you want and the life you want, you've actually first of all just got to take that breather. Because when you're in, I suppose it brings us back to our burnout point, doesn't it? When you're completely exhausted, sort of reflecting on your identity isn't your priority, but you're just so glued to it. Well, that's certainly my personal experience and what I see in other people quite often.
Yeah, and if you think about that identity over hundreds of years, it's kind of a very specific, you see it in films, like the role of a lawyer is always like this white middle-aged man in a business suit shouting in the courtroom or something like that. It's unfortunate that beyond just law firms, I mean, I think it's viewed by society as this certain type of person that can make it very, very difficult, especially for those in the kind of minority or vulnerable groups. Is that something you see where people struggle the most, Helen?
What do you mean exactly by the most vulnerable groups there, Nick?
Because they're of a need to kind of to play into this profession where there is a lot of judgment and like these strong stereotypes.
Yeah, I suppose I'm just wondering, so I answer your question correctly though, what you mean exactly by the vulnerable groups. Are you talking about people who are working in law, or?
Yeah, people with disabilities, especially.
So I think, you know, in law, from my experience, it's a tough gig. It's a tough career. You have to have a huge amount of stamina. And I think for anyone who perhaps needs, I don't know, special adjustments or a different working plan, maybe it's because they've got kids and they're, you know, it doesn't matter, they're a woman, they're a man, whatever, they've got kids, they've got other things to balance, or maybe they've got disabilities. I can see that you know, it's a huge challenge, you know. And I think we're seeing it more. It's interesting coming out at the moment. There's a lot of stuff which I feel like is really recent around, for example, neurodiversity, and people speaking up about the needs there, and actually how things need to be done differently to make sure that, you know, it's more of a fair playing field and everybody has the chance to excel, and it shouldn't all just be done in one way. I think the problem that I've seen a lot of the time is that people are so overstretched and pushed in law firms. It's just sort of whoever can keep going the longest and work the hardest that they're the ones who seem to do very, very well. That's historically. I think things are changing now. But because of that, it means anyone who is sort of unable to just keep up with that kind of pace ends up suffering more. And I think that's why, for example, in the Law Care survey and many other surveys, we see, for example, women, people with disabilities, people from ethnic minorities, all of these things, they suffer more from burnout and from seemingly mental health issues, which I think, given that backdrop, it does make sense to me.
Yeah,
so
it's Go ahead. Go on, Jens.
No, we're touching a lot of interesting topics here. So if we sort of backtrack to the image of the successful lawyer being portrayed in media, that's the professional mystique of lawyering, which is, of course, a middle-aged white man, which is supposed to be the epitome of successful lawyering. And then in particular, if you have like a brutish partner, that has to be a very successful person. But if you look into the research on what are the traits that are associated with success in research, you don't find that at all. I mean, there are obviously partners out there that are that are brutish, but they are successful despite their lack of social intelligence and being able to lead themselves properly and being able to connect with other people and so on. So research is really supporting a much more humanistic person, still being conscientious, ambitious, competitive, and so on, but also someone who is a team player, who's able to rally the team and support the team and so on. So I find there's a lot of encouragement when you look into that research. The problem I see is that everyone unconsciously is discriminating. So you have, of course, the seniors in law firms discriminating, you have clients discriminating, you even see female associates in law firms discriminating each other. So I saw one study in which all the lawyers were asked to sort of rate a couple of colleagues. And so the males were rating the females lower than males, and the females were rating the females lower than males. But we see no support at all that female associates would be less effective than the males. If anything, there are indications that are even more effective than the male ones. So there is really no support for that. And then you have, of course, the minorities and what comes with that. So, I mean, the most typical stereotypical example is if you have, if you're a non-white female who is a petite person and you sit with a client and the client is asking, when does the lawyer come? You just automatically assume that you're an assistant because you're not that big white male, that you're expecting to see. And so there are a lot of problems when it comes to that. And then at the same time, when you look into research, what are clients really looking for? And now we're talking business law. We're not talking criminal law or family law. We're talking business law. They do look for people that are listening to them, that are interested in them, that are not just sort of reloading, delivering, shooting legal expertise. They want to connect, they want to be seen, they want to be heard. But then many business lawyers, when you ask them, what do you think that clients want? They often respond, well, they want someone who's punctual, who's upholding the confidentiality, who's providing a successful legal strategy, and so on. They always focus on the legal expertise being provided. But that's not really what clients are prioritizing. They expect it, but in the room when you meet someone, it's the quality of the relationship that is much more decisive. So it's very conflicting with, on the one hand, you have the systematic discrimination, and then on the other hand, you see a lot of support for a much more humanistic lawyering style, even in business law.
I find it very interesting what you say, Jens, about the research, what it shows about men and women there, and perhaps it's interesting because in my career I've never felt held back being a woman. I've never been, without being pejorative to anyone in any position, but no one's ever thought I was the receptionist or the secretary or whatever, again, without putting anyone, any particular position down at all. It's just, as you say, going back to those sorts of stereotypes. The firm I was in, maybe it was different because of this, but I mean, the managing partner was female, and actually the majority of partners in litigation were female. And I found that being a female partner was actually really advantageous in many ways, because I would often on the other side have a lot of aggressive male solicitors or barristers, because I think litigation can often attract those personality types. But because I didn't really rise to it, I didn't really generally get personally involved. I would just sort of, I don't know, it was a bit like water off a duck's back. But I think, I think men can get quite riled with men a lot of the time. Well, they'll send quite a personalised, angry letter, and then you'll see the other side actually and getting riled up as well. And I think as a woman, I don't know, I feel like there are some advantages in that you can sort of maybe take that step back a bit more easily, or you are treated differently, even by male counterparts. I've seen situations be diffused by female partners, for example, where you think if that had been a man, that would have actually blown up there. So it's interesting to hear about the research, because I suppose actually it doesn't necessarily, it isn't completely in line with my experience in law. And I wonder sometimes, whether there are different jurisdictions and the research is different for that, or I'd just be so interested to know more about that, because I wonder if, I wonder if there are big differences between countries and systems and all of that.
I think there's a big variance among practice groups under the partners you're working, and also from person to person. Some females do have a really sort of strong cultural capital, being really comfortable moving in sort of upper class environments. Some might be coming from more humble backgrounds and feel more insecure, and that certainly goes with if you have a non-white background and so on. So there are many different factors that come into play, and certainly law firm culture also, and also type of practice, I think might come into play there, right? But we all know that research is supporting mixed groups, to have really mixed practice groups, different perspectives, different takes on it, different cultural capitals, and being able to draw upon. So that's certainly something that we know for sure is very important. But then we see also that law firms are losing female associates at a higher rate. And also, of course, ethnic minorities also tend to leave law firms at a higher rate. So the staff turnover, being able to retain these talents, is also a big challenge.
I think what you say about the multiple like jurisdictions and factors involved is very apt as well. Like earlier when I said about vulnerable groups and you asked me to clarify, I went to list a few, and then I was going to say female, and now I thought, hold on, my experience is like yours as well, Helen. I don't see that. I wouldn't class that as a vulnerable group at all, even though it's listed here in some notes that I've got. It's not something that I would class as vulnerable. And then I started to think about the different groups, and it is a lot more complicated than just this is a problem for this group. I think it just varies from firm to firm, country to country. At the end of the day, it's really, really hard to group people together. It's something that we keep trying to do as humans, group everything, but actually everyone is an individual and everyone is entirely different. So when you come to group things, it can cause issues.
But certainly I would say that a consistent finding, regardless of whatever country I've seen when it comes to lawyers, is that females are more exposed to sexual harassment, that there are more issues when it comes to parental leave, and that the stress levels unfortunately are also higher for females, and the higher levels it's really complex. It partly involves there are greater levels of insecure overachievement, and then there is also, of course, the lack of gender equality at home. Who is doing everything at home? And it's not that often that it's 50-50. And the higher up you come in a career, the more important it is to have gender equality back at your kitchen table. We see that research on CEOs, and for instance, that female CEOs that are in non-equal relationships with males in this case struggle a lot more. And then so it's not just at work, but also off work that is quite decisive for the outcomes for females.
I think that's what I see in law a lot, and what I've witnessed is that I think from the studies, etc., you can see that I think it's over 50% of females, or at least 50%, are going in as trainees. Yeah. You know, girls do better than boys in education at university. They go into the law firms. You've still got lots of female associates. And then it's at the point really where you're starting to look at the promotions, whether that's senior associate, partner, the number of women drop off. You know, I think it's something like, I can't remember off the top of my head, but something like 30% of women are sort of partners of quite a lot of firms in the UK. Obviously, the stats vary. But then, you know, that includes salaried partner. When you come down to equity, you're looking under 20% for many of the firms. And this is no coincidence. And you know, I think it is tough as you want to have a family, as you say, and the work often falls more onto the woman. Or during the pandemic, I saw it with a lot of friends who were lawyers struggling because, you know, they were having to look after the family, look after elderly parents, look after children, etc. And I think there does need to be that there is more of a shift now as well towards sort of shared parental leave and all of this kind of stuff. I think, and as a woman, I think you're right about all of the sexual harassment stuff. I think that's huge. I think you can probably speak to any woman in her career and she can give you at least several stories, law or non-law. And that's a whole other can of worms, I reckon. But I wouldn't, as it's interesting about your terminology, Nick, because it's interesting to talk about people as, you know, vulnerable. I don't know if vulnerable is the word I would use, but I think there has to be serious consideration given to women in the workplace still, and why it is that, you know, we're not seeing that an equal number of women on boards. There aren't many female CEOs. That they're totally underrepresented in partnerships. I mean, this isn't a coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's impossible to just talk about these groups as being vulnerable. We have to talk about the issues and where the problems are, as opposed to just saying all these different people have problems. You actually need to go into them in a bit more detail. So yeah, thank you very much for bringing that to the conversation. Do you think that law firms are doing enough? It's kind of a loaded question.
It's a bit like saying our government's doing enough, I think, it's just generally in the world. I mean, I think in terms of law firms, we've got a huge disparity. And actually, this is something as well, I think, is not understood by people outside of the legal sector. You talk about law as if law is just this thing that is the same all over. It's not. It's different in every country. In this country, we have a split between solicitors and barristers, which you don't have in most jurisdictions, which means the job is essentially different depending on which side of the fence you're on. You've got, you know, West End firms, you've got regional firms, you've got London firms, you've got international firms, you've got the American firms, all of which have completely different cultures in terms of, you know, the expected working hours, and, you know, what they expect of their employees and their culture overall. I think in terms of our firms doing enough, I mean, I think the overall answer is no, because I think law is so far behind other industries in terms of actually understanding well-being, the importance of having a culture where people feel psychologically safe, as in they're not going to be criticised for their opinions or whatever they want to state, you know, where people can bring their whole selves to the workplace, where they feel supported by their teams, where they can ask for what they need, etc., and that will be considered. I think all of that is an issue across the board. But so no, some firms are better than others. Some people are lawyers and they leave work at 6 every day. Some people, you know, are working 100-hour weeks every single week. So I think it's really hard to put everybody into the same bucket there. I mean, what is interesting is I think we're seeing a really big change now, perhaps since the pandemic, since Gen Z is really coming through and making different demands. We're seeing firms like Stevenson Law come up, which are saying, hold on a minute, We're going to give everyone a stake in the equity. We want everyone to feel part of this business. We want to respect people as human beings. We don't want to drive people into the ground. And I think we've got these firms on the fringes now of the legal industry, which are starting to make waves, starting to do things differently. And I think with time and, with the changes from the pandemic as well, I think, Nick, you also mentioned there's a lot of stats to show that actually law firms are having trouble to recruit. With all of that in mind, actually, I think law firms are going to have to start responding a bit more.
Yeah, it's good that you...
Yeah.
Sorry, go on, Jan.
So I think whether law firms are doing enough is a really interesting question, because I spent my first 10 years trying to come up with things that the law firms could do in my mind. And then I accepted the limitations, that they have a really successful business model, that the partnership DNA, the organizational DNA, is really specific and really sort of limiting, because you need to have a lot of agreement in the partnership to be able to make progressive interventions and so on. And then I sort of stepped back and I said, okay, I need to play within the boundaries, within the framework of the operations of law firms. And then when the pandemic came, I thought it was so fascinating. In 2019, they all said we can't work remotely. And then in the spring of 2020 in Sweden, we saw the largest law firms going into remote work in 48, 72 hours. And they kept running. They billed more than ever. It was difficult. People were suffering. There were high levels of stress and so on. And for some, the stress levels went down. But what was interesting is that they successfully exceeded any wild expectations with regards to transitioning into remote work, and then keep working in remote mode more or less for 12, 18 months. And so for me, the key takeaway from the pandemic is like, hey, if the industry and me, I ended up thinking just like them. Okay, you can't work in remote. I accept that, fine. If we all were dead wrong about that, and every single one, I would say, was dead wrong about that, what else are we wrong about? What else is possible within the limitations of the organizational DNA of law firms? So I think we have a collective hypnotism saying, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that, and so on. So right now I'm sketching on something I call extreme lawyering, in which I bring together lawyers in groups, and we just challenge and say, okay, what do we want to do? What is possible? And drop all those limitations and explore what could be possible. And perhaps, 9 out of 10 things won't work, or some things won't work for everyone. But I'm dead sure that we will be able to find keys and tools that are unthinkable today, but are not impossible at all, especially when you have hybrid work and there's greater flexibility now. Before, maybe you sit in a floating tank 3 days, a week, and that will reduce your stress levels. Or maybe you will have some assistant in another country, that you're delegating to it. I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities now that are just not thinkable. So I find that to be really, really fascinating as we come out of the pandemic and just have a very verified or visceral experience of things not supposed to be possible, and just being able to take it away.
Simply asking better questions instead of why can't we, it's how can we.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it comes down to the profession again. It's, if we change things, it's risk involved, and our job is to mitigate risk. So it's kind of, it's just like a cat chasing its tail almost.
Right.
We haven't spoke much about imposter syndrome. I know that's a kind of speciality area of yours, Helen. Is it possible for you to describe a bit about what imposter syndrome is?
Yes, absolutely. So imposter syndrome is where, by the way, it's not a diagnosable psychiatric disorder or anything like that. But it's really a sort of state of mind where we doubt ourselves on a very deep level, despite lots of evidence to the contrary. So, for example, it might be that feeling of, I'm a fraud. Everyone's going to find me out. oh, I won't speak up in that meeting because I'm going to look stupid and everyone will know I don't know anything. You know, it's that constant feeling of I am not enough, basically. That's how it's how it manifests in our everyday life. So, for example, it will stop people, as I say, from speaking up in meetings, from putting themselves forward for promotion, from putting themselves forward for different opportunities. And it can be really, really debilitating. And at some point or another, research suggests that 82% of people will suffer from imposter syndrome. I absolutely do myself. I have done my whole career. And despite having, tried so hard to get rid of it, but I think it's actually something that we have to learn about, understand, and realize actually that we can transform it into something really, really positive. Because if we turn it on its head, it actually creates the foundation for a growth mindset. So instead of, chastising ourselves for the mistakes we make, we think, okay, so I didn't do that quite right this time. Let's learn from it. Let's see how we can actually do better. Because the reality is, if you aren't feeling a bit uncomfortable with a situation, then actually you're not going to be pushing yourself. So to be in that place of growth, actually, we're probably always going to be having these imposter feelings. So it's about trying to manage it and actually make it into a strength, or that's how I certainly view it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had it right now before this call. I mean, I've never chaired a webinar before, and I had those questions going through my head. It's like, I'm a legal tech guy. I'm not a wellbeing expert or anything. Obviously, I've got two amazing speakers on the panel with me, but at the end of the day, I just had to accept that this was an opportunity for growth. It's an opportunity for me to practice and learn a bit more. But also it's an opportunity to bring a very much needed and important topic to the table, and to have these discussions is vital. And at the end of the day, all I need is that awareness that it's just some thoughts I'm having. And as you said earlier, you aren't your thoughts, for me to feel comfortable to take this call forwards.
Yes, so the imposter syndrome I find really, really fascinating, because what you have is two traits that are specific for lawyers, I would say. One is the high personal standards, the perfectionism, and then you have the self-doubt. And so it's so interesting that you meet these incredibly successful people and they still haven't regulated their self-esteem. They're still struggling with the same level of self-esteem as they had in law school. So they have straight A's, they got them partners. I even meet managing partners, and they all resonate incredibly powerful. There's no other way I know that is more effective in terms of sucking out the air of a room of partners than talking about imposter syndrome, because he's talking about me, they will find me out, that they're all like bunnies in headlights. It's so incredibly fascinating. But it's also a shame, because it's hard to enjoy the fruits of your labor. You are denying yourself this success, enjoying the fruits of your success that you rightfully earned. You are verifiably a brilliant law student turned associate, turned partner, turned managing partner, and you're still struggling with this. You're still thinking they will find me out, or I was lucky this time again. And so it creates a lot of unnecessary problems. So for instance, if you have the imposter syndrome, for you to receive critical feedback will become a very powerful trigger, because it just hits you at the soft spot and you feel discovered, or that they found out I am a failure, and you fall apart. You overreact to very important critical feedback, which you need to have that steep learning curve. On the other hand, if you receive positive feedback, you are not likely to accept it. It's like Teflon, water on Teflon, because if you would be able to accept positive feedback, it would have increased your self-esteem over time. And if you have this particular trait, you are not accepting it. You say, oh, you're just being nice, or I was lucky, and it was Eric I worked with, or all these ways of discounting the success that you've earned. And so if you're giving someone positive feedback and are not accepting it, you're not going to give it again. It's like something didn't really fit. And when you give them the critical feedback, they fall apart. So it's like, I can't figure out these people, And so these are traits that become more common now than 25 years ago. So it's right when it comes to the older lawyers saying, well, there's something different about the young generations. They're actually right about it when it comes to this particular aspect of it. And then you take a person with this particular trait and you put them into a law firm. And what is being provided there, according to research, is what is called anxiety and amplification. So you're in a tournament. You're competing with others. You are working with documents that are really hard to assess on a scale in terms of how good was this. And then you're getting, critical feedback. And so you have this sort of lawyer of tournament, which is probably the worst place to be in the world if you have imposter syndrome. So it's really ironic. It's really unnecessary. And it's really, really quite common. And I'd just like to share something. When I talk to lawyers and partners about this, there is actually something more called the meta imposter syndrome. So I'm just going to share it with you because I find it so fascinating. When you know that many around you have the imposter syndrome, but you know that how competent they are not like you, the real imposter. So that's often, the reaction when I talk at law firms. Everyone is like, he's talking about me. All the other ones, they're not the real imposters. I'm the only one who's really. So they keep discounting it as you try to hold up the mirror. They're struggling with it. So I find that to be just so fascinating and so powerful. And this is correlating very, very strongly with what we're assessing in ambition profile, I would say. So I'll share the link later, and you can just take the test and you will automatically get a report, which has a lot of tips and tricks and best practices and so on. So it's fully aligned with that. So I'm really excited to hear Helen talking about it, because for me, I found it to be the single one most important aspect of the lawyer personality when it comes to stress and burnout.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, I can, I recognize it very much in myself, I think, which is why it's probably a topic that I'm so fascinated by. And, I see it in so many other lawyers as well. And, I think back to my first day at university, and I remember sitting down in the lecture hall and, I'd got in and I'd earned my place just like everybody else. And I think to scare us all on the first day, they said, well, statistically, X number of people will fail the first year, don't be one of those people. And I think they told us that to obviously stop people from drinking their way through first year and, barely turning up to the exams. But of course, I took this as, well, that was definitely me. I didn't really deserve a place there anyway. I was absolutely going to fail. And, that just put the fear of God in me. And so it sort of had the opposite effect. And actually, that's probably something for law schools and law firms to think about in terms of how they incentivize and speak to their staff.
So what is happening here too, as part of this trait, is that when you're facing a challenge, like a business project or an exam at law school, it tends to trigger negative stress. You can have positive stress, like arousal, which is like, I really need to focus and stop playing around. And now it's time to do this. And I will do my very best and we'll see what comes out of it. But if you have self-doubt, then it's all anxious about it. So, and the interesting thing here is, one of the things that I discovered in my research is that lawyer stress doesn't start in a law firm. It starts in law school, because you have the same traits facing challenges like the exams. And so when it comes to work-life balance, it starts in law firms. No, it starts in law school. A lot of people with this trait are struggling with their study life balance in law school. That is, enjoying time off with good conscience and sleeping well and just having a balanced life. They struggle already in law school, and you continue to struggle with it in a law firm. So I find that to be incredibly powerful and also a bit optimistic in a sense. Mm-hmm. It's not just all about the law firms and what you're facing there.
I would say it also, in my experience, it starts a lot earlier than that. I think, it's no coincidence that we end up with lawyers and law firms who are perfectionists, these high achievers, etc. I think it goes back to our childhoods and the type of our personalities, how we were brought up, what our parents expected of us, what pressures were put on us at school. And, it's going to be the people who did well at school consistently, who get into the top unis, who get into the top law firms. And so I think really it probably goes back to the root of most of us, even a long time before law school. I don't know if there's science on that, but that's certainly what I've probably observed in others and can relate to myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
I read somewhere once that during the first kind of 6 or 7 years from birth, that's when our kind of brain's forming, and the influences around us at the time are quite strong. Beyond then, it's kind of repetition that influences us more, but those parents especially can have quite an impact to our way of thinking.
It's really hard to figure out what is what, because you have nature in terms of DNA, and then you have nurture in terms of the environment you grew up in. But of course, you have the same source. Your parents are the source of your environment and their own DNA, which is reflected in how they're raising you. So, but certainly there is lots of interesting research on that as well, which you will find in Lawyer Know Thyself by Susan Dykhoff, which is a milestone work on lawyer personality, and especially in early traits and so on. So that's an interesting source for anyone who wants to go deeper into that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And I think that's what therapists are pretty good at, is uncovering those links between kind of childhood memories and traumas and things and the way you think right now. And they bring that kind of they bring that into the field of awareness for you. And then when these kind of like imposter syndrome happens in day-to-day life, you're able to go, oh yeah, that's because this happened when I was younger, or that's because that happened. Or, as you said, Helen, on your first day of law school, that comment it's quite an awful thing for them to say. I think it just installs fear into us from the start, and it sets the kind of precedence for the rest of the career almost. It's amazing how one comment like that can stick with you so powerfully.
It is amazing. And I think it really shows, doesn't it? We never know how we are affecting other people. And it's just another reminder, I think, of that, this whole be kind movement. Just think about the words you say, think about how you behave, because it does impact other people. And I suppose also just to reflect on what you're just saying about, how far the things go back. And, I'm sure we've all got our own stories if we can think about it, as you say, especially if you've had therapy, etc. It's, knowing about yourself and what triggers you and what makes you the person you are. But, I can very clearly see why I am how I am due to many factors. Now, there's, one thing, I always tell the story wrong, so I'm pleased my dad isn't listening to this, but there's, the film Apollo 13, there's a bit where I get this wrong, so sorry for anyone who actually really does know Apollo 13, but when they're coming back to the ozone layer, whatever it is, where they could burn up, I think it's at this point, they turn around and say to the command center, but, what if we don't make it? And the guy just turns around to them and says, failure is not an option. And I avoided doing my terrible American accent there, which I would do if I wasn't being filmed for a webinar, but sorry, guys. And so but after, for every exam, I'd say to my dad, oh, I'm really nervous. What happens if I just fail? What happens if I don't do well? And he'd turn around and he'd say, well, what do we say? And I'd just say, failure is not an option. So in my mind, from the earliest memories in childhood, failure was not an option. So, that and many other things I can tell you about. I was programmed to be, I'm absolutely going to kill this. I will reach the top and I'll do whatever it takes. And I would bet you, for most people in the top law firms, they will have similar stories, because, I think to have that kind of mindset with that kind of tenacity, it has to be built in somewhere.
Yeah. And at the same time, it's absolutely unrealistic, self-torturing. It's just superhuman. Of course we make mistakes. Of course we drop the ball. Of course we learn from it and take responsibility. But there's so many people on Friday are like, what was your week like? I totally bombed on Tuesday. What about the rest of the 60 hours you put in that were just excellent? And have that expectation that 100% has to be right. And if it's broken, it's never gonna, we will not be able to fix it. Most things are okay, not great perhaps, but we can take responsibility. And certainly we need to be able to have the resilience to manage in a mature way shortcomings and mistakes that we're making. So, and it's that kind of like armor and facade that we're putting up that is such a big problem in law firms. And that's why I also love talking about imposter syndrome, because if you can get partners to stand up and say, hey, I suffered from this for 25 years, then that breaks down the wall instantly. And all the associates, what? You are a big role model. You're the superhero. You're doing everything great. And so on. Suddenly it's possible to talk about doubts and shortcomings and all those things in a very open way. So you can really shift it around. Just such a powerful transformation in a group if you can introduce the concept and get the leaders to own it. And it's such a relief for them as well. They're like, wow, is this what I've been struggling with all these years? And it is. And sometimes it's also a way for them to start enjoying work more, even the seniors. For the first 20 years, they might be telling themselves, I have to do this, I have to succeed, I have to make it for the money. And then perhaps they become financially independent and they keep working 60 hours. And now they're telling themselves, actually, I like this work. I like coming in and hanging out at the office and doing exciting work. I should have known and recognized this a long time ago, and it would have been a much nicer journey instead of struggling so hard.
Yeah, and it's good to get those things out anyway and just talk about them, because they're not occupying your head as much. You're able to get them out and actually think about doing your job a lot more, to be present in the moment, as opposed to all these secrets that you've got because you're so scared of someone once said that the most vulnerable person is the one with so many secrets to hide. They're scared of being found out. Because they're all being repressed. And I guess that's what ultimately does lead to burnout. It's because you're repressing and repressing and repressing, and you make yourself ill.
Right. So one thing also that I think is really important as you start to recognize this, because this is also the same trait that is driving you to check your email the last thing you go, turn out the lights in the evening and the first thing in the morning, because it gives it a feeling of being committed and effective. And of course, it's minimizing your rest and recovery. So it's a core component in developing burnout. And it's such a shame, because once you start to recognize this yourself and you say, okay, I'm not going to check my email so much during the weekends and evenings and so on. But if your practice group continues to work in the same way, sending emails with urgent messages, Tuesday evening, 10 p.m., it forces you to keep checking your email. So it's really that group behavior that you need to disentangle, and you need to come up with rules of engagement, saying, for instance, if there's something urgent on a Tuesday evening, for instance, then we text each other. Hey, there's an important email for you. Otherwise, we have to check the emails all the time. And if you do it, then I do it, and then you have to do it. And no one can step out of that whirl of correspondence that is always minimizing our rest and recovery. And so that is really critical. And we are way beyond the point of maximizing effectiveness at the cost of well-being here. The way people are managing their inboxes during non-office hours is just so dysfunctional. It doesn't look like it's just, and it's worse after the pandemic, for sure. So that's a huge problem that we need to crack. And I think it can generate a lot of well-being if you can have, I can rest, I can enjoy being with my family. If there's something urgent, they will call or text me. Much more effective.
Yeah, you kind of just feed into the narrative, Ivan, and people know that you essentially become a walking doorbell.
Yeah.
I think the issue with that a lot of the time might be that not everyone is copied onto chains. So, for example, if you know you're working on something important, or somebody might get back to you, I think that's one situation, isn't it? And that might be the case whether you're an associate, senior associate, partner, trainee, whatever. I think it's about, as you say, it's whether it is, I think for me, in my job, it's whether it was fact driven or anxiety driven. So is it a fact that I really actually need to be checking my emails this evening, as in there is something urgent going on, so this evening I just have to be switched on, or am I checking because of anxiety? And as I got more senior, I started to be able to manage that a lot better and think to myself, okay, so I'm, actually I don't need to be checking my emails this evening. Therefore, after this point, I'm going to have a cutoff. I think at the junior level, it can be a lot more difficult to have that kind of autonomy, because especially if a senior emails you and then they don't get a response, again, sort of going back to the culture point, actually, how are they going to judge you? Will it be negatively? You need to know it isn't going to be negative. I think it's really that anxiety point. And I think for lawyers, I mean, many lawyers just live in a perpetual state of anxiety.
I love that, anxiety driven and fact driven. So let me share some of my research on that, because I wanted to explore that. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, you can ask people, how do you rate this assessment? I often check my work related email outside of office hours. And then among Swedish lawyers, the number is 69%. But then we know this is not really a good question, because, of course, you may have to do it often. It might be clients in the US and it's a deadline and so on. So a much more qualified question would be, I check my work-related email outside of office hours more often than I need. That's a much more relevant one. And here you see 59%. Only 10% difference there. There are only 10% that are really checking it often and actually needing to do that. And we all know that there is an excess here that is incredibly toxic from a stress and burnout perspective. But it comes back to the group culture in your practice group, and then also yourself, your own, is this a fact-driven decision to check your work-related email as you're turning out the light, or is it an anxiety? And we all know that doing this is, of course, like Russian roulette to sleep. Suddenly there's an email there and it's giving you a stomach ache. It's not something you can address or do something about now as you're going to sleep, but you bring it into the most, important part of the day in terms of rest and recovery. So certainly a risk behavior right there. But I love the distinction you're making there between fact-driven and anxiety-driven, and not falling into the trap and just saying, oh, we have to do this often, and have no nuance, and not following the dynamics of saying, well, you closed the project yesterday. Now there is a downtime before you start up the next project, for instance. It's not true that everything is up here all the time. It's a roller coaster, and you need to follow the dynamics of the roller coaster.
I think
got me thinking about emails now. Just turn my phone over. I was like,
you're just checking your emails, isn't it? I think that's a really interesting point you make about the roller coaster as well. I really like that, because I'm thinking particularly of transactional lawyers here. Our bodies and our minds are not really wired to be able to switch between extremes like that. So in the sense of, you've been on for 2 weeks straight, you go from this, having to check all the time, this state of real super high anxiety. You're not sleeping enough, you're not eating well, all this stuff, because you're in a deal and it's going to close. The deal closes and they say, okay, enjoy your downtime. Well, your body can't just suddenly go, oh, okay, I'm totally relaxed now, And so I think that's often the problem as well. It's people, what I hear lawyers talk about all the time, I used to say it myself, but it sort of breaks my heart slightly. It's this feeling when people say, I just feel really guilty because I'm not working hard enough now.
You can't enjoy with good conscience.
You can't enjoy it, yeah.
No.
Because also we're so programmed as well, hit your chargeable target. So it's like, oh, okay, well, what are you billing? Oh, I'm billing 3 hours a day right now. Okay, but like 3 weeks ago, you were billing 20 hours a day. But then they're left feeling guilty. Again, that probably comes back to the personality type. But it's super unhelpful for individuals, for firms. And I think this is exactly the kind of trait or perhaps symptom of what's going on, which causes burnout.
And this is so important. It is the law firm and it is the individual together that is creating the problem. But if you don't allow yourself enjoying time off, then you have a huge risk factor and problem right there, of course. And sometimes I like to challenge lawyers, just sit on your couch and do nothing for 10 minutes. Nothing. And the anxiety arises. It's not just like, oh, this is nice, I can just chill for 10 minutes. No, this is such a stupid exercise. I'm wasting time. All of these thoughts arising in you because you feel lazy and so on. So you're minimizing your own rest and recovery through all those thought patterns. And if you don't recognize that, then it's tricky. You're just going to fill it up yourself whenever there's a gap.
Reminds me of when I started to try meditation for the first time. I was quite horrendous at it, but after a while I realized it was the practice of doing it, not actually being good at it, that was the important part. You're training your mind to become more comfortable with just winding down.
I think if you take, for example, top athletes as well, they have to get these really strong, disciplined mindsets to be able to reach the top. And I know I'm going on having coached a couple of professional athletes. Their minds were different from anyone I'd ever met. Their discipline was incredible. The way they viewed the world was different from anyone I'd ever met. And I think they wouldn't have been able to waste time. I don't want to say waste time. I'm very into meditation, etc. myself, but they wouldn't have been able to just spend time doing nothing either. They found that really, really difficult because they had to feel productive all the time. And it's interesting because I feel like we walk this tightrope between, on the one hand, perhaps it's a negative thing or it pulls us down because we push ourselves too hard. But on the other hand, you've got these phenomenal minds which are capable of achieving things that the average person cannot. Lawyers are not your average person. The people in the city of London who are at the top of these law firms, they have incredible minds, and they are like Olympic athletes in terms of where they are in their industry and how they've trained their minds. So I think there's a really interesting point we have to realize, which is actually at what point are we training ourselves? How do we have to create a mindset for success? And at what point does that actually start to hinder us, and making sure we stay on the right side of that balance? And this is what I work with a lot in terms of performance. It's like, okay, let's look after our well-being, but also accepting that in terms of the lawyer demographic, they're not your average person.
No.
So
yeah,
we're working with that as well.
Yeah, that is so. That is the tricky part, I think. Being really committed, really ambitious, and then there's a fine line. And it tips over and it becomes counterproductive and anxious-ridden and just really a source of problems in your life, in your relationships, in your physical health and your mental health and your professional relationships and so on. So there is that fine line. The one difference, I think, if you compare it to physical athletes, is that it's obvious for the physical athletes that when they show up for a contest, they try to be well-rested and fresh. And that's not always the case of the mornings of every lawyer I've known. It's almost like a badge of honor. I was like, oh, I'm stressed, there's too much. I'm in demand, I'm successful, and so on. Not really recognizing that this is minimizing your performance, and it's not conducive for a long-term top sustainable performance. So I think there needs to be a more clear connection or correlation between well-being and performance, that they always go hand in hand. You can push yourself for some time, but it's not, in the long run, it's not going to work.
You mentioned athletes. I've got a friend as well that coaches athletes. I remember him saying that quite a common pattern is for them to kind of win the race or the competition, and then immediately join another race that is an even bigger challenge, and keep setting bigger and bigger challenges until there are no more challenges. And then they kind of almost feel purposeless for a while because they've kind of achieved everything. Obviously the challenges in law are very different and they're almost endless. It's quite, that kind of statistic fascinated me.
Well, that's also the sort of cruelty with a law career if you have imposter syndrome, because you have top grades when you go to grammar school and high school, and then you go into law school, and suddenly it's competitive, and you start to become almost like average. Perhaps you ace, and then you come into the top law firm, and now you're definitely average, and you feel like crap. But it's like being at the national team and feeling average and like, oh, I'm no good. It's like, well, you're top 10 in the nation, and then you keep exceeding, become senior and partner and so on. So there's always that, as you rise to the top, there's a regulation that makes you feel more average, because you always compare yourself to your peers. And you have what is called an ideal type. So say, well, Karen is always writing the best drafts, and Eric is doing the best pitching for the clients, and I'm just, you pick the best out of everyone, and then you compare to this, super colleague unconsciously, and that makes you feel like crap, even though you clearly, it's a meritocratic process. You belong to the team. You earned your way there. There was not a mistake in you ending up on the national team of this particular law firm.
I definitely felt like it was a mistake with Linklaters. Definitely. I could not believe that I got into a firm like that. No. And I remember I came from a very normal background. Nobody in my family had worked in the city or was a lawyer. I didn't really know anything about it. And, exactly as you describe, I went to a very normal school. I was very much top of the school because, I was a big fish in a small pond.
Yeah.
When I got to uni, I've already described, had the imposter syndrome, thinking, oh my gosh, they mean me when someone's going to fail. When I got into Linklaters, I remember arriving there, and in my cohort, I think there were 54 of us. So a big cohort. And, people came from all over the world, all sorts of different backgrounds. People spoke 5 languages. They were concert pianists. There was a girl who had been like a double in some of the Harry Potter movies for Hermione. And lovely, lovely girl. I remember just sitting there thinking, there are literally movie stars in the room. I speak French and German, but there are people who speak way more languages than me. I'm not a concert pianist. And, you just sort of, but by the time you spend about 10 minutes there, you think, how on earth did I get in?
There was a mistake.
Oh, yeah, there must have. Somebody has made a big mistake. And I remember thinking all the way through my training contract, I'm going to be found out. At some point, they will find
It didn't subside after 2 weeks.
No, it didn't. It absolutely didn't. And it was only when I became an associate that I was working with trainees and thinking, actually, I was a pretty good trainee, and I could see it for myself. And I think that's how difficult it is. Exactly as you say, it's like each time you're raising the bar for yourself, each time you move into a new pool, and that's so hard to get your head around.
It is for sure. So while I remember it, I'm just going to share the link to the test for anyone who wants to take it. The data stays with me. I have full confidentiality. You get a report. You will not get an invoice. So go ahead.
Perfect. I'm going to fill that one out myself.
I'm definitely doing that test.
If anyone has any questions amongst the audience as well, please do feel free to put them into the chat. Any points? Was there any topic that you wanted to particularly discuss that I haven't brought to the table?
Gosh, I think we've covered off quite most of the points, really, Nick, that I can think of.
Yeah,
chatted for a good hour and 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting. I mean, in the short perspective from. If you look at it as an individual, your law firm is not going to change very much. So you only really have 2 choices, I think. One is to do a pivot in your career, change practice group or change law firm or type of practice or something like that. And then you can, of course, work on yourself. And I think it's absolutely ridiculous if you work long hours in such an important career. You should work on yourself. There's no doubt about it. Everyone should have 10 hours of coaching or therapy or whatever. There is nothing that will give you more of a return on investment. So on the one hand, there is like nothing you can do because the law firm is not going to change very much, I think. On the other hand, there's a lot you can do in terms of your career and working on yourself and taking greater responsibility and have that sort of mental hygiene during non-office hours, and how you're checking your work-related email and starting up a conversation about it in your practice group, and how should we really reach out to each other when it's really urgent outside of the office hours, for instance, and what you can do about it. So there we go. That's one thing. And I think one aspect too that is really interesting, just coming back to the imposter syndrome and perfectionism and all that, I think law firms are systematically hiring those people. So what you're doing is you're hiring people with the best grades, doing the best interviews and so on, but it's really hard to assess what went into it. So when I look at top A students in law school, some of them studied for like 60, 70 hours per week to get those grades. And then there are those brilliant people who put in 25 hours. But when you recruit, you only see the output, the grades that they achieved. And I think some of the people that were putting in 60 to 70 hours perhaps will not flourish in a law firm. They will always be struggling, and I think they are probably much better off in a more regulated working environment.
Sure. I've got a question here from Rajmi for you, Jens. Can you talk about the Stanford Duck syndrome?
Yeah,
I've not heard of it.
Yeah, right. So that's actually what I was alluding to here. When you take the best students from Ivy League universities in the US, and they're like ducklings in a pond, and you only assess and recruit what's above the waterline, but you're not being able to see who's pedaling like crazy beneath the waterline and who's coasting along. So there is a systematic recruiting of insecure overachievers, of people with imposter syndrome, but there's really no coaching or helping. Please, if you have the imposter syndrome, don't think that, oh, I better just give it up. Please don't give it up. That's not the point we're making. The point we're making is that if you become aware of this, and if you get perhaps some support, or if you read up on this, you will be able to navigate with much less effort and much more stress and fretting. That is the point. It's not that we're trying to tell people that don't go into the law firms if you have imposter syndrome. We're just saying that, well, you need to do some work there. And if you do that, you can become incredibly productive, because you can turn it on. Sometimes it's just you need to have that overdrive and overcommitment, and sometimes it's time to take off. You're ending up with a business project and giving that permission to enjoy time off with good conscience.
I was going to say, Jens, I think if the law firms stopped recruiting people with imposter syndrome, they wouldn't have anyone left.
No, they're among the best people. They are. There's no doubt about it. Brilliant people, but they struggle unnecessarily.
Sometimes all you need is that awareness of what's happening when the situations occur, and not even trying to change it in the moment necessarily, just being able to observe it and being aware of it, and over time it just gets easier.
Right.
Well, that's takes us nicely to an hour and a half, so I'd like to thank you both very much for your time. And if any of the issues or topics discussed today resonates with anyone here, I know two very good coaches in the area who are on this call. So yeah, please do reach out to Jens or Helen if you want to kind of explore things further.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.